a revision of Act 5, Scene 3, the final scene of the play. And I'm going to try and make this as efficient as possible, but there's a lot of plot twists and turns in this scene. So we ended the last video with Edmund claiming to be a man of truth and honour. And of course, that sets up the dramatic arrival of his brother Edgar, who will challenge him and who will ultimately defeat him. And that's why, while the play has a very bleak ending, and there is no doubt whatsoever that question about the play being offering a dark and pessimistic view of humanity does require us to write about all the corruption and all the selfish behaviour and all of the folly and all the family division. Ultimately, the play does show that, good will win in the end, and that evil is defeated, because in comes Edgar, and Edgar challenges Edmund, and Edmund is ultimately undone by the combined forces of Edgar and Albany. So we'll start here talking about Edgar. He comes in, don't forget at this point he's still in disguise, nobody knows who he is, and he asks he wants to challenge the Earl of Gloucester, okay? And he says to his brother, "Draw your sword, that if my speech offend a noble heart, thy arm may do thee justice. Here is mine. Behold, it is the privilege of mine honours, mine oath and my profession. I protest, meagre thy strength, youth, place, and eminence. Despite thy victor sword and fire new fortune, thy valour and thy heart, thou art a traitor. False to thy gods, thy brother and thy father, conspirant against this high illustrious prince, and from the extremest upward of thy head to the descent and dust below thy foot, a most toad-spotted traitor." And this is one of the fantastic monologues of the play. Like, here's Edgar, who was weak and malleable and, slightly pathetic at the beginning of the play. This is Edgar, who was criticised for his foolish honesty, and over whom his brother seemed to have this, incredible ability to influence, and now he's strong, now he's a hero, he's heroic, he's brave. Look what he says here. He says, "If you're offended by my speech, get your sword out. Here's my sword, right? Here's mine. I'm ready to fight you." So that kind of, idea, that masculine idea of heroism, which has to be married to physical bravery and the willingness to face danger, Edgar has that now. He's changed. He's become stronger through his suffering. And then you have this fantastic, blunt and true depiction of his brother. That you are a traitor. You're false to your gods, false to your brother, false to your father. You conspired against Albany, the high illustrious Princess Albany. You are, from your toes to your head, a disgusting traitor. It's a fantastically dramatic moment. And again, think about the questions that we've talked about in the previous video. Think about how Shakespeare's language and imagery helps to develop, for example, character. Well, here we have a character in terms of Edmund as a toad-spotted traitor. Again, great example of nature imagery in the play. And here we have the idea of revenge, the theme of revenge being explored through this very, very, very popular monologue, or very interesting monologue by Edgar. Sorry, popular is the wrong word. So how does Edmund react to this? First of all, he reacts by denying his guilt, okay? And then he challenges, and it's showing himself to be physically brave, he challenges Edgar's position by fighting him, by saying, "Right, come on then, let's go." Look what he says. "In wisdom I should ask thy name, but since thy outside looks so fair and warlike, and that thy tongue, some say, of breeding breeds what safe and nicely I might well delay by rule of knighthood, I disdain and spurn. Back do I toss these treasons to thy head, with the hell-hated lie o'erwhelm thy heart, which, for they yet glance by and scarcely bruise the sword of mine, shall give them instant way, where they shall never rest ever." And he calls for the trumpets to blow, and off they go. The two brothers fight, okay? So Edgar is certainly physically heroic here, willing to put his body on the line, his life on the line to do right. But if we accept that Edgar's physical bravery, associates him with heroism. Well, there has to be some element of that with Edmund as well, because Edmund doesn't cower, he doesn't hide, he doesn't try to run away. He is cornered and he decides to fight. Now, whether or not we admire him for that, the truth is that he does fight, okay? So Albany and Goneril intervene, but what Albany crucially does is he gives the letter to Edmund, and that's the letter that contains the proof of the conspiracy. And Goneril, who he is now saying is guilty as Edmund, she says, if I do, the laws are mine, not thine. Who can arraign me for? So she sees herself as being above the law before she's a queen. When her husband tells her to shut your mouth, and then he tells her, you're worse than any name. Read your own evil. Okay? When he tells her, look, I know what you are. I know how corrupt you were. You wanted to kill your own husband so you could live with your lover. And she says, so what? But of course, this is like Lear at the beginning of the play. She thinks she's still trying to assert her power, but she no longer has any power because that power has been taken from her by Albany because he sees or he understands or he perceives that she has committed a crime. Goneril runs off, leaves the stage. Edmund wounded Edmund admits that he's guilty. What you have charged me with, that have I done, and much more, much more. The time will bring it out. 'Tis past, and so am I. And then he asks for for the identity of his assailant. But what art thou that hast this fortune on me? If thou art noble, I do forgive thee. Now, there's loads of things going on there that are really interesting. This is the moment that a lot of people look at Edmund and go, oh, well, actually, he redeemed himself at the end because he said, I did it. But if you look at the next line after that, he says, more, much more, the time will bring it out. And to me, that's him, hinting at the terrible order that he has, when he says much more, the terrible order that he has given for the double regicide of the Queen of France, Cordelia, and the King of Britain, Lear. But he's not saying, oh, I'm really sorry for what I've done. Oh, and by the way, I've put the death sentence on Cordelia and Lear. What he's saying is, yeah, I've done what you've accused me of doing, and I've done more. So there's no sense that he's feeling, bad for what he's done. There's no sense of him trying to fix or to repair the wrongs that he has done. In fact, that's a rather odious statement there, because even in his defeat, even in the fact that he's lost, even the fact that he knows he has nothing left, at this moment he's still enjoying or reveling in the wicked deeds that he's done. So Edmund is a really, 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 villainous character. I know you're all thinking, but what about what happens? We'll see what happens at the end. We'll talk about that in a second, okay? So when he asks Edgar who he is, he says, look, it's me, it's your brother. I am no less in blood than thou art, Edmund. If more, the more thou hast wronged me. My name is Edgar, and thy father's son. The gods are just, and of our pleasant voices make instruments to plague us. The dark and vicious place where thee he got caused him his eyes. And that's a very, very, very interesting speech, especially if you're thinking about the theme of justice in the play. So Edgar says, look, it's me, it's your brother. But then he says, this part here is so important. He says that Dad suffered because he was a sinner. He says that you were sent by the gods to punish Dad because he was a sinner. And again, we have disease imagery. We have Edmund associated with the plague. Remember at the start of the play, he said, wherefore should I stand in the plague of custom? And here we have the word plague being used in relation to Edmund at the end of the play as well. But what Edgar is saying there is that Gloucester was a sinner. He was somebody who indulged in pleasant vices. So in Gloucester's case, that was extramarital sex. And as a result of his sinning, the gods sent an instrument, Edmund, to cause Gloucester suffering. And then we have this incredible metaphor of the dark and vicious place where thee he got. Now, the word got there, that refers to conception. In Elizabethan times, the verb to beget, or the past tense begotten, means to be conceived. And what he's saying is, you were conceived in sin, and as a result, Dad suffered and lost his eyes. In other words, you can't escape justice. So this is a really interesting insight from Edgar. He believes in the natural order. He believes in justice. He believes that ultimately wicked deeds will be punished. Edmund says, thou hast spoken right, 'tis true. The wheel has come full circle. And again, if you talk about imagery in the play, there's another reference to a wheel. Remember at the beginning of the play when the fool talked about how let go thy hold when the great wheel runs down the hill? Remember later on in Act 4 when Lear described himself being bound upon a wheel of fire? And now here's the wheel again. Now there you go. If you're asked a question on imagery in the play and you're asked a question on the power of imagery, talk about the imagery of the wheel in those three examples. Here's Edmund saying, I began with nothing and now I've reached and I've become nothing again. I've lost all I have gained. Okay, I've lost all I have gained. Albany looks at Edgar, can't believe that Edgar is that man, that peasant who came towards him. But Albany asks him, where have you been all this time? Where have you hid yourself? Have you known the miseries of your father? And that's when Edgar goes on and tells a story. I'm not going to dwell on it now. He tells a story about his decision to flee, to pretend that he was poor Tom, changing himself into a madman's rags, to assume a semblance the very dogs disdained. Then he met his father with his bleeding eyes. We know the story. Then he looked after his father until just recently, and when we learn at this moment, we learn that Gloucester is dead, because he said, I asked his blessing, and from first to last told him my pilgrimage, but his flawed heart, a lack too weak to conflict to support, twixt two extremes of passion, joy and grief, burst smilingly. So what he's saying is that Albany is dead. And the reason Albany, well, not the reason he's dead, but Albany died when, just before the battle, not knowing whether he would survive and come back to his father, Edgar decided to tell his father the truth, to tell his father that poor Tom, that was your son Edgar, that when you went to the cliff, the person who guided you after that attempted suicide, that was your son Edgar. I am your son Edgar. And he says that Gloucester's was so shocked by this and so pleased, see joy, to be reunited with his son, but also so grief-stricken at the suffering that his son went through, and it was all his own fault, that he died of extreme passion, a heart attack or immense strain. So Gloucester, the tragic figure Gloucester, is dead. And again, you think about the body count so far in the play. We know, for example, that Cornwall is dead. We know that Cornwall's servant is dead. We know that Oswald is dead. We don't know where the fool is. He's disappeared out of the play. And now we know that Gloucester is also dead. Edmund is dying. We know Regan is poisoned. So all of these characters are going to be, their stories are coming to a conclusion, a very satisfactory conclusion in terms of the drama. Edmund is moved by this speech. The speech of yours has moved me and shall perchance do good. But speak on. You look as if you had something more to say. Albany says, if there be more woeful, hold it in, for I am most ready to dissolve hearing of this. Albany is devastated. He's going to start crying because of the story that he's being told by Edgar. Okay? And he says, this would have seemed a period to such a love, not sorrow, but another to amplify too much would make much more in top extremity. And then he says this, right? When I was big in clamour, came therein a man, who having seen me in my worst estate, shunned my abhorred society. But then, finding who 'twas that so endured, with his strong arms he fastened on my neck, and bellowed out as he would burst heaven, threw him on my father, told the most piteous tale of Lear and him that ever ear received, which in recounting, his grief grew puissant, and the strings of life began to crack. What's he describing? He's describing how he, while he was out with his father Gloucester, came across a man who at first rejected him, then realizing who he was, threw his arms around him, fastened his arms around my neck, embraced his father, cried, physically cried, telling this sad tale of him and Lear, and then cracked up. His grief grew puissant. So somebody who's broken by life experience. And we're all going, who is this guy? Who is this person that you met, Edgar? Who was it? Albany wants to know, who was this? And then we get one of the great tragedies at the end of the play. It was Kent, sir, the banished Kent, who in disguise followed his enemy king and did him service improper for a slave. And again, the imagery is amazing. Look at the words enemy king. Those two words shouldn't go together. It's an oxymoron. Why would you follow your enemy king? If the king is your enemy, why would you follow him? Well, you follow him because you're Kent and you were the personification of decency and honour and nobility in the play. And here we have this terrible news that this man who was nothing but steadfast and loyal and brave and honourable, Kent, has been broken by grief, broken by suffering, is no longer able to cope. And that image of Kent doing service going beyond the service a slave would do for his master, for Lear. Showing, again, think about loyalty and duty, think about insights into human behaviour, think about a dark and pessimistic view of humanity. There's so many different questions that you could use this key moment to refer to. But that idea that Kent is unable to cope, that Kent was broken by that the strong, powerful, tough, resilient, all those words that mean the same thing, Kent has been broken by his suffering. That adds to the bleak ending to the play. Then we have the news that Goneril and Regan are dead. The gentleman comes in. Your lady, sir, your lady and her sister, by her is poisoned. She has confessed it. Edmund, in this kind of almost comical, if it wasn't so tragic moment, says, I was contracted to them both, all three now marry in an instant. So what happened is that Goneril had poisoned her sister, so Regan is dead, and then Goneril took a knife and stabbed herself with the knife, and the knife is still smoking with the warmth of her blood. So Goneril is dead, Regan is dead, Cornwall is dead, Oswald is dead, and the body count, Gloucester is dead. The body count is starting to rack up now in this terrible tragedy. Albany says, produce the bodies, be they alive or dead. This judgment of the heavens that makes us tremble touches us not with pity. And again, a great line to think about in terms of the theme of justice. This idea that the gods punish wicked doers. So we shouldn't feel sorry for wicked doers when they are punished. So Goneril and Regan got their just deserts. Now again, I think that's interesting to dwell upon, because I don't think Goneril and Regan started the play off as wicked and evil. I think they, at the beginning of the play, they had our sympathy, that we felt a level of empathy with them because of the terrible abuse that they suffered at the hands of their father. But there is no doubt that they embarked upon a course of action, displayed behaviour which was beyond reasonable, beyond understandable, cruel and wicked, and therefore they again have got their just deserts. The judgment of the heavens touches us not with pity. And I think Albany's words are shared by the audience. Then Kent comes on stage. I am come to bid my king and master good night. Is he not here? Kent is like Lear now. He's gone. He seems to have gone mad. And when Kent reminds them of Lear and Albany, this is the moment. Lear and Cordelia, this is the moment when Albany goes, oh yeah, what about Lear and Cordelia? Where are they? And the bodies of Goneril and Regan are brought in, but Edmund says, yet Edmund was beloved, the other poisoned for my sake, and after slew herself. And then he says, some good I mean to do, despite of mine own nature. Quickly send, be briefing it to the castle, for my writ is on the life of Lear and Cordelia. Now, this is the moment that, people lean into when they're trying to find reasons to forgive Edmund. So Edmund's saying, I feel so bad seeing the bodies of Goneril and Regan, and it was my fault, and hearing what happened to my father, and seeing how noble my brother is, and seeing the suffering of Kent. I want to do one good thing before I die. And then he tells them about Lear and Cordelia and his plan, or his writ, to have them killed. Now, again, folks, is this enough to redeem him of his crimes? No, it's not. But does this add a layer of a depth to his character? I suppose it does, the fact that he tries to do one good thing at the end. But actually, for me, what Shakespeare's doing here is playing with the audience. This is not about Edmund. This is about the play having a dramatic ending. Because when Edmund says, because we're devastated, Gloucester's dead, we can't believe Goneril and Regan are there, their bodies are lying on stage in front of us. At least Edmund is captured. And Edmund's going to save, Lear and Cordelia will be saved because of Edmund's intervention, and at least there will be that satisfactory. And what Shakespeare's doing with those words is giving the audience hope so that he can snatch that hope away. You see? That makes it more dramatic, because now we have this. Look at Albany's words: "Run, run, oh, run!" And their hope has suddenly filled them that they can actually save Lear and Goneril, Lear and Cordelia. But we know that that's not possible. Okay. At that moment, Lear comes in and he's carrying Cordelia dead in his arms. And we have this really, really moving final speech. The repetition of that onomatopoeic word howl, that primordial word howl, which captures so powerfully the pain of Lear. Howl, 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 howl. And then holding the body of his daughter. Oh, you are men of stones. Had I your tongues and eyes, I'd use them so that heaven's vault should crack. She's gone forever. I know when one is dead and when one lives. She's as dead as earth. Now, there really isn't a moment more tragic in all of Shakespeare. And Shakespeare, wrote Romeo and Juliet. He wrote Macbeth, who says the tomorrow, tomorrow, and tomorrow speech. He wrote Hamlet, good night, sweet prince. Like, he wrote Othello, put out the light and put out the light. He was the master of tragedy. And this is, for me, the most tragic moment, because Lear learned what was of value in his life. He learned that love was all that mattered. And Cordelia was a fundamentally decent human being, and she's been murdered. And he's had that valuable, that precious jewel that gave him love and a sense of belonging and a sense of acceptance and a sense of forgiveness. That's been snatched away from him, and he's broken by it. So that's the tragedy, There is no happy ending in this play. The bad guys yet are punished. Edmund is undone, unmasked, and eventually dies, we'll see. Edmund, he dies, he's born off, okay? Goneril and Regan, the bad guys, they're dead. Cornwall is dead. Oswald is dead. Yes, yeah, right. All the bad guys are dead. But so's Gloucester. And while he was a flawed man, was he a bad guy? So Kent's heart is broken and his mind is gone. Was he a bad guy? Cordelia was the personification of honesty and decency. She wasn't a bad guy. Look what's happened to her. So the play's ending is, if you were studying this play as a comparative text, in terms of general vision and viewpoint, it's extremely bleak. It suggests that suffering is an inescapable part of the life experience. They're all struck. Look at the short sentences communicating the sense of horror. Is this the promised end, or image of that horror? Fall and cease. Lear then, gets this kind of feather and wants to kind of see if there's any breath. He's desperately, he's losing his mind, to see if she's alive. And he says, a plague upon you, murderers, traitors all. I might have saved her. Now she's gone forever. Cordelia, Cordelia, stay a little. Ha, what is it thou sayest? Her voice was ever soft, gentle and low, an excellent thing in woman. I killed the slave that was a hanging thee. So there's this idea that it was a staged suicide. This was Edmund's unbelievably cynical plan, that to hang Cordelia, to hang Lear, and make it look like because they lost the battle that they took their own lives. But when Cordelia was being hanged, Lear stabbed and killed the captain who had taken on the commission. He took on he bravely tried to save his daughter, but it was too late. Still gets me every single time. And then, there's Lear's final moments, okay? Kent intervenes, tries to offer solace to Lear. He tells him that, I'm Kent and Caius, we were the same person. He says of Caius, he's a good fellow, I can tell you that. He'll strike it quickly too. He's dead and rotten. Lear's mind doesn't understand, what's going on. Kent says, no, I am the man. I'm here. It's me. I was Caius all along. Lear just says, you're welcome hither. And Kent understands that Lear's mind is gone. And he says, all's cheerless, dark and deadly. Now, what about that for a use of language? All is cheerless, dark and deadly. So 3 adjectives to describe the world at the end of King Lear. Cheerless, dark and deadly. Talking about how Shakespeare uses language, including imagery, to develop his themes. Talking about the play as a dark and pessimistic view of humanity. Talking about the insights we gain into the human experience from the play. Talking about the role that Kent plays. What's the dramatic purpose of Kent? Well, certainly he adds great drama and a great sense of tragedy to the final lines of the play. Okay. We find out Edmund's dead. His body was carried off. We find out he's dead. We know that Albany's response is practical. That's but a trifle here. I don't care that he's dead. You lords and noble friends know our intent. What comes to this great decay may come should be applied. For us, we will resign during this life of his old majesty to him our absolute power. And here's Albany trying to fix things. Like, he's a fundamentally decent person. He's saying, right, well, I know I'm the most powerful man in the kingdom now, but you know what? I don't want power. I want to restore the natural order. I want to give it back to Lear. I want to give it back to Lear. But no, it's too late. Lear's gone. His mind is gone. his last speech. He says, "My poor fool is hanged." He says, "Why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life, and thou no breath at all?" Talking to Cordelia. He looks at her lips, look there, and then the stage instruction, he dies. So he dies broken, holding Cordelia in his arms, and he truly is a tragic figure. But ultimately, all this is his own fault. Ultimately, his daughters would be alive. Ultimately, he'd still be king. Ultimately, all these people who have died in this play would still be alive were it not for his abuse of power. And I think that idea that the play is about power, it's about kingship, it's about the authority that a king has and that a father has, and it's about what happens when power is abused. And that's why I don't think you can, while Lear is a tragic figure at the end, I don't think there's any question that he doesn't deserve a happy ending, because his ego, his narcissism, his vanity at the start of the play knocked over the dominoes that collapsed the natural order and led to this tragic ending. The reference to the fool is interesting. As you can see, those are the words of the play, "and my poor fool is hanged." Right there, that's it there. Now, if you look at the copious amount of scholarly investigation of this play, almost unanimously, scholars say that that's an evidence of Lear's, his mind breaking down, because it was Cordelia who was hanged, and he's holding Cordelia's body, but he's getting mixed up between the fool and Cordelia, and therefore, when he says "my poor fool," he's talking about Cordelia. That's the accepted interpretation of that line. But also, he does say, "My poor fool is hanged." And we don't know what happened to the fool. He disappeared out of the play in Act 3, and it's one of those mysteries of the play. What did happen to the fool? And there are loads of theories around it. But for me, I think you can read far too much into scholarly speculation. For me, we know Cordelia is dead. And for me, he references the fool. He says the fool is hanged. So we have to presume that the fool is dead as well. And that's another decent human being who knew he was going to be crushed if he held on to the great wheel when it ran down the hill. But regardless of that, he did hold on. And he is dead, and it adds to the tragedy. And the play ends then with this conversation between Kent and Edgar and Albany, who are shell-shocked. They want him to be alive, but Kent says, "Vex not his ghost. Let him pass. He hates him much that would, upon the rack of this tough world, stretch him out longer." And again, look at the imagery there, the torture imagery. The rack is an instrument of torture, where somebody was stretched out until their ball and socket joints popped. And this image of life being torture, and that death being the sweet release from the torture of life is again a very bleak way to end the play. And the play ends, of course, with Albany trying to, restore order. He's a decent and noble man. He knows he's not suited to rule, so he wants to hand over power to those who are suited to rule. He sees Kent and Edgar as being the perfect people. Looks like he's going to make the same mistake as Lear did by dividing power in the kingdom. He describes the country as a gored state, which I think is one of the great symbols of the play. To gore it's again an image from the natural world. So an animal that has horns, if like a bull or like a deer, if it uses its horn to pierce the flesh of another animal, then it gores it. So that's a terrible wound, a bloody wound. And the country has been terribly wounded by all the suffering that was brought about by Lear's abdication and his decision to try to retain power. But Kent, of course, says, no, this is not for me. I am not capable of ruling. And then he tells us that that he is suicidal. He says, "I have a journey so shortly to go. My master calls me. I must not say no." And that means that the crown will go to Edgar. Okay, so Edgar, this decent, fundamentally decent, tenacious man who has, through his suffering, learned leadership and authority and decisiveness, and who has always been moral and decent and noble, he will lead Britain into the new age post-Lear. And Albany has the last words of the play. "The weight of this sad time we must obey, speak what we feel, not what we ought to say. The oldest had borne most, we that are young shall never see so much, nor live so long." So it is a fantastic final scene. It is very, very, very complicated. There are loads and loads and loads of twists and turns. And at the end of the play, again, let's do the body count. I'm sure I'll miss somebody. At the end of the play, Cornwall's servant, Oswald, Goneril, Regan, Edmund, Gloucester, Cordelia, and Lear, and we have to presume the fool, they're all dead. And they're all dead as a result of the foolish behaviour of a very powerful man who wanted his ego flattered at the beginning of the play. And ultimately, the tragedy of the play has to be placed at Lear's door.